lens. What we're trying to do is look at the language of this amendment and see, based off of what's there and stated, does it get us toward the goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing? We have folks here who have looked at the language. We have folks from the administration. We have Tim Davis from the administration for D&D. Brian Glasscock is here from the BPDA. Sanal is here from the BPDA, and Christy Doyle is here from BHA. Did I get everyone from the administration? Okay. So what we're going to do is, I actually wanted to make sure we got to the amendment itself. I don't know if anyone's had an opportunity to look at it or see it or have it. I know that Christine sent it out. If it's well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it then over to the folks who have looked at it and been working on this and are part of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Task Group, and on their thoughts on the amendment, not just the necessity, but on the language. And then if the administration has any thoughts on the language, and I'll say this quite clearly, the people representing the administration today are not going to be pro or against this so much as they're here to hear, I guess, about the language. Director Golden previously testified about this, and he about equity in 2018. In February of this year, he attended the working session, at which point he stated that the BPDA does not need this equity lens in the zoning code, and that they have a culture of equity, and it is not written down, it is not enforced, it's not a standard, and it's not part of their planning, except in as much as it's part of Imagine Boston 2030's general statement. That's their guiding for affirmatively furthering fair housing at the BPDA, which I find to be woefully insufficient. So I don't know if the administration had any thoughts about the language. If not, we're going to go to the advocates. Tim, Sanal, Brian, or Christy.
This is Tim Davis from the Department of Neighborhood Development. As this matter is mostly related to zoning and the work of DPDA, I'm here today primarily, and my capacity is helping to oversee the report, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing report, and how that's written. And so I am mostly here today to listen to what advocates and the counselors are interested in terms of what the language of what that zoning amendment may be.
Thank you. This is Sonal Gandhi at the BPDA. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Councillor Edwards and the other councillors on the call, along with the advocates. We're excited to be here. Hear your thoughts about the language. I know you've received a letter from Director Golden outlining some of our work and some of the concerns we had on the language. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and concerns. And also, want to make sure that you know that we have been very seriously working on this. We continue to work on this, and we'll hear your thoughts and concerns about the language. Thank you.
Brian, did you have anything, or we can go to the advocates and city councilors?
Yeah, I know. I share Sonal's concerns and interests. We want to see what the language you're proposing looks like, how it would fit in with existing zoning language and protocols we have in place, and how it would impact development going forward.
As Sanal mentioned, Brian Golden, the director of the BPDA, submitted a letter after the last working session, wherein he went through many ways in which he feels the city generally is dealing with this, affirmatively furthering fair housing. He then, the last part of his letter, 2 bullet points addressed the language in the amendment. One was, and this letter has been sent out to my colleagues, one was to clarify certain terms such as displacement and economic dislocation. The BPDA is in the process of developing formal guidelines to address direct displacement. So he looked for more clarification He felt that there was a lack of clear standards, regulations, or guidelines to accompany these terms, and that introduces a certain amount of uncertainty and unpredictability in the review and approval process. He also said they would need to clarify the processes, methodologies, and staffing structures in order to enforce this proposed language, or any, I guess, order in the zoning code that affirmatively furthered fair housing. It would require the development of new processes, as he stated, methodologies, and analytical tools to conduct complex modeling and analysis. It is important to have clearer conception of those tools. It would require significant additional city and BPDA staff and resources, along with interagency procedures to ensure success. So what I understood from there is there was questions about clarity and what it would need to bring this to fruition. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that he had stated that on the record. Do any of my colleagues have anything burning to say right now? Otherwise, we wanted to get to the language and the goals of the amendment. I see nobody. Okay. So with that, I wanted to turn over to Justin Steele from MIT. And then if Nadine is on the phone and then Margaret Monsell.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, for including me, and Councilor Bach for inviting me. I'm honored to be here with all of you to speak in support of this amendment. I think we all are aware of the history of racial inequality and white supremacy in Boston, and that there's dramatic current racial disparities in educational attainment, income, wealth, and health that are tied to housing and neighborhoods. And I think that backdrop makes this effort to include an affirmatively furthering fair housing provision in the city's laws particularly important. I think we saw great progress from the Obama administration at the federal level in the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is currently being rolled back by the Trump administration. I think that creates a really important opportunity for Boston to lead and set an example for other cities and states of what can be done at the local and state level to advance fair housing. I think in leading, it's really important to be clear on the specifics so that this policy has the hoped for effects and doesn't just become kind of nice words that don't get implemented in the way we would all hope. And so I think it would be important to, in this policy, be as specific as possible. And I think this would make the BPDA's job easier about what the conception is of what it means to affirmatively furthering fair housing in new developments, to have units that have developments that have more affordable units, that have a diversity of unit sizes so they're accessible to families of various sizes that are representative of the people who already live in Boston, that have affirmative marketing, that are accessible to those with disabilities. And I think what we're looking for, I think one potential measure of that could be new developments that advance the city's efforts to address racial disparities in housing cost burdens, in housing overcrowding, and a requirement that the BPDA can take to its community meetings across the city in every neighborhood, saying we have an obligation to create more affordable units in every development, in every neighborhood, with a mix of unit sizes, and especially in middle and higher income communities because of the responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. I'll just start there and be brief by saying I think this is really important and I support it fully, and I think it's important to include in it as much as possible clear measures of what are the racial disparities that we hope new developments will help address, like housing cost burden, housing overcrowding, and others. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadine, are you available?
I am, but I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Turner, who will speak on behalf of GBLS. But I just want to say on behalf of all our low-income clients who are so in need of housing, and housing that comes with opportunities to be able to live where they want to, we are in support of this. Margaret, do you want to take it over?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate what Councilor Edwards has already said. Required under federal law, various provisions of federal law that the city of Boston affirmatively further fair housing. There can be legal consequences which is critically important and long overdue in order to ensure that the city is meeting its federal and state anti-discrimination obligations. Just like to say that I think in the process of the
Margaret,
the
I'm not sure
group
if
that is
it's a connection issue. Margaret?
group on the city's affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Margaret, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think there's a connection issue. There's an extreme delay when you're speaking. And
Yes.
Slightly broken up.
Okay.
I don't know if you might want to log out and come back in. Okay. What I'll do is I'm going to go on to some of the other folks who are here, but I do want to hear from Ms. Monsell about specific concerns or suggestions for the language also in the amendment. Kathy Brown and also I think it was Hajar. Are you on behalf of ACE, Hajar? Yes. Okay. So Kathy Brown, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay.
We're really supportive of this amendment. I believe it's really important. And I appreciate in the last discussion, the councilors bringing out the importance of, having explicit goals and measurements around how the BPDA is going to do this. And that is just so critical, and just really support, we really support your amendment. It's definitely a key part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing that Tim is working on and that our crew has been working on for quite some time. But this is probably one of the most important parts of the AFH is making sure that planning is, has a fair housing lens. And the development, in terms of we're looking at what's going on in Boston. So I think this amendment is really, really critical. But I look to other folks to, speak more in detail.
Okay. Hajar from ACE. You still have ACE on the phone or on the Zoom? I think let me unmute you.
Yes, I always talk muted.
Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, city council members, and good morning, housing advocates. And thank you for asking me to speak. I'll speak to the question around how to implement guidelines around displacement. And I will just speak from the perspective of an advocate. And I wanted to just encourage, and I speak with a listening ear for the communities in Roxbury and represented by many of the coalitions that ACE is a part of. And I'll just say that the one clear continuous request is that when planning to address displacement and address how you're planning with guidelines that relate specifically to the neighborhoods in which you are building, guidelines that allow for mixed socioeconomic demographics with regard to AMI and with regard to economic opportunity, and planning for those that will be displaced. The BPDA regularly has a target demographic and a target amount of income that it gives to developers that's known amongst the advocate community, and then also known amongst developers. This is usually 80% of AMI. If you're planning for 80% of AMI and you're working in a community whose AMI is 50%, for example, then you plan for a certain number of displaced individuals. We do not think that that's asking for financial commitment that is beyond the scope of your responsibilities. And so if it requires retooling the BPDA or creating another arm of the BPDA or whatever it requires, it is something that is maybe 80 years overdue. And so actually addressing that issue would put all of us out of work, and that's what we look for. So thank you.
Thank you. Did we get rejoined by Margaret? I had someone call in. I don't know if Margaret can hear us or she's on mute. Nadine, can you hear us?
Yes, and I believe Margaret is on the phone, she told me. So
Okay.
If you unmute her, she should be able to talk.
I'm going to find that number and I will unmute her. I think.
It's,
All right, Margaret?
Hi, sorry
Great.
about that.
No problem.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure where I was, but I was, the biggest thing I was emphasizing is that there is a federal legal requirement that the city affirmatively further fair housing, dating back to the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and there are other provisions of law that require the city to certify annually that it is affirmatively furthering fair housing. There is nothing currently in the zoning code that ensures that the city is affirmatively furthering fair housing. So it's long overdue to have this language in the zoning code to ensure that throughout zoning processes and planning, public meetings, decision-making, et cetera, that the city is systematically affirmatively furthering fair housing throughout. One thing I'd like to say is that the language of the zoning code proposed amendment is, I think, terrific language. It will need to be fleshed out, I think, as BPDA notes in its letter, but a concern that all of us advocates have is that there really is a need, after the passage of this proposed amendment, for BPDA to have a comprehensive fair housing audit by an independent fair housing auditor of all of BPDA's processes, from planning, meetings, decision making, et cetera, to look at how the BPDA operates and to ensure that the BPDA is affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think we recognize that the BPDA is making efforts in that direction, but it's critical that fair housing be a core value. It's every bit as important as transportation or other issues, if not 100 times more important. And it's our feeling that there's a need for an independent outside fair housing auditor to examine how the BPDA goes about what it does and to ensure that the language of the zoning amendment is implemented in the day-to-day operations of BPDA. But the zoning proposed order should be passed by the City Council. It's long overdue. I have a small edit that I sent to Councilor Edwards this morning, and we may have some additional small edits, but we strongly urge that the zoning code proposed order be passed.
Just to let folks know, the edit had to do with incorporating additional language in the East Boston section. So I know everyone printed out a copy of the amendment and is studiously following along. I say that smiling, but for those who are not and may want to understand how this amendment is at least outlined and embodied, you'll see it's actually it's specifically focusing on Article 80. Those are the large projects. And we specifically focus that because that is where the BPDA does a lot of its most intense planning with planners, with the community, and they look to project into years into the future. And so this is already their wheelhouse of looking at, of planning with, of going at something with Article 80, and it's understood projects over a certain size. Correct me, for 10,000 square feet, 100,000 square feet, Tim? 10 thumbs up, 100? Huh? What is it now?
It's 100. It depends on the size of the project. Article 80, the small project, large project. So it's 20,000 and 50,000.
So minimum 20,000, and it goes up for Article 80. And so the goal was to have, they're already having, the BPA, these intense and good and necessary conversations. And so we wanted to be part of that conversation, the impact on certain protected classes of individuals. That is what the amendment is doing, looking at the impact to assure there isn't discrimination, but also following the federal mandate to remove obstacles to discrimination and to go further than that. So the first thing we do is add in definitions or add in language such as affirmatively furthering fair housing, and we have a definition for that. We have a definition for analysis of impediments, displacement, and meaningful actions, because you are supposed to do that. You're supposed to look at the remove all impediments to opportunities. And so we put in that definition. That's the first thing we do. And that's where I believe Director Golden was honing in on some of those definitions, not sure if they were very clear. That's the first section. Then we go into their approval process, almost like their checklist. Then we go into mitigation, which is when they enter into a cooperation agreement with a developer, and making sure that that also falls within an equity lens, and that when they're doing these negotiations and getting certain monies or getting certain services, that they're checkpointing that to make sure that is also through an equitable lens. Then there are certain project reports that developers have to do anyway, or at least analysis that they have to demonstrate that they've done on tidelands, on traffic, and all of these different areas. We are adding equity lens to that set of reports. So, and the content of the reports. And then finally, we're adding to the standards for approval. Again, on the checklist that you have to have also an equitable lens, making sure that they have actually complied with affirmatively furthering fair housing. And for those of you who are not familiar with the process, with a lot of this, it's developers offering their ideas for what the zoning should be, and the BPDA correcting, changing, rejecting, approving their ideas. So this is not necessarily the BPDA's burden so much as it's the BPDA being a guardian or check to developers ideas and thoughts around their own zoning. And we want them to be an equitable guardian for the city of Boston, as they do for Tidelands, as they do for so many other things. So the developers are going to be the ones who are going back and forth and trying to make sure that their language is actually making sense in affirmatively furthering fair housing. And the BPDA saying, yes, it does, no, it doesn't, that's not clear, and putting it on them. Finally, we also approve we require certification of fair housing from city agencies. So we think this is a multi-agency review designated by the mayor of Boston, again, for the approval process, because as their approval goes through, no sooner than 60 days after they receive the thing, they have to go through, possibly have a public hearing. We want to have a certification for that certification of fair housing from city agencies that have also looked at and analyzed this. So we put this into sections of Article 80 process. That's the general overall citywide amendments that we have done, or we're suggesting. We then, because my district and because it's the single largest private development in Boston's history, have also added language to specifically reviewing the PDA for Suffolk Downs. And we add an equitable lens that requires the BPDA to also look at the impact on protected classes, the creation of new job opportunities, job training pipelines for low and moderate income residents, ESL programming, career counseling, technical assistance, all of those things to look at for the mitigation package and also the plan for Suffolk Downs. That's pretty much it. And I believe if we can get this language and we can agree on a standard that can be monitored, that can be enforced, we will set a standard not just for other neighborhoods, but possibly for the nation in how to literally zone equity. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's an incredibly brave and bold thing to do, and it shouldn't be something that we shy away from. So again, that was the summary of the sections of the amendment. I am going to turn over to any of my colleagues who may have questions, concerns, or thoughts in order of their arrival. Councillor Breadon.
Good morning. Thank you for holding this working session this morning. I come to this discussion from the perspective of my neighbourhood here in Alston-Brighton. We have seen a tremendous amount of development over the last 10 years. So much of it is not affordable. It is not designed for families, and I really support this amendment to see if we can develop a more inclusive approach to planning of housing, housing that is suitable for families and housing that will accommodate a range of incomes. Right out here in Alston-Brighton, our inclusionary development policy is pegged at 70% of the area median income, and that excludes so many people from access to more housing that they can afford. So I really support this amendment and commend your work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Breadon. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, and to the panelists for being here. I also support these changes as you outlined, Councillor Edwards. I think it's important and it's needed. I had one comment or question. Under the Article 80 process, as we were developing the South Boston waterfront, were these provisions part of the process where we were including having a racial lens as we discussed development? And if we were or if we weren't, did we at one point say, you know, we're not really capturing the true composition of Boston, and maybe we have to make changes? Did we ever stop that process and say, you know, maybe let's take a step back and take a review and see what is going right or what is going wrong, instead of just continuing with the status quo, basically?
I will turn it over to the administration. Councillor Flynn, at the last working session, when Director Golden was there, we did ask specifically about the south, as well, what I call the seaport, what you have, south, I guess the seaport, Councillor Flynn, but we did ask about the area in your district, and he did say that at the time of the planning, which was start and go, start and stop, that analysis did not happen formally. But I will turn it over to Brian or Sanal or Tim, who can maybe add some more flesh to those bones. Maybe or correct me.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn, for your question. The Article 80 process, as Councillor Edwards mentioned, the South Boston waterfront was in starts and spurts. As those of us who've been here for a long time remember the South Boston waterfront as parking lots, and trying to get that to be developed. And we're learning our lessons from development, making sure that we are improving our processes. Sessions such as these are incredibly important to understand kind of how we can improve our processes and make sure that our planning and development review is as inclusive as possible. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. And the reason I call it the South Boston waterfront, when I was in high school, I worked down there as a popover boy at Anthony's Pier 4 for 4 years. So I have a great relationship and love for that neighborhood. But I also, as a city council, wished to see, more Asian faces in the South Boston waterfront, more African American, more Latino faces. We can use it, I guess, as an example of what to do or what not to do as you're developing huge pieces of undeveloped land, I guess, like Lydia has over in East Boston. Making sure that you include that racial component it's critical. It's critical to a neighborhood to have to be diverse, to be welcoming. So those are my comments. Again, thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. I have Councillor Flaherty, then Councillor Bach, with Councillor Asabi George in third. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, that's the reason I'm on is the same concerns that our colleague, previous speaker, spoke about, which, with respect to the South Boston waterfront, there was a period of time that the community was involved in the process, and then they kind of got elbowed out. And this really lies. This was all the previous administration. So let's state facts. And the fact of the matter is that the previous administration seized the opportunity and took all that linkage money and basically pretended to be like Santa Claus across the city. And as a result of which, we don't really have a neighborhood down there. We don't have a neighborhood feel. You really feel like you're in New York, probably more than anything. So I concur with my colleague from South Boston with respect to the missed opportunity down there and the lack of a real sense of community and diversity. And as a result of which, let's learn from that and hope they don't do the same in your district, Madam Chair. It's the East Boston waterfront. We're not going to start calling it Eastport. It's a great community over there. East Boston, has a tremendous amount of pride, and they add tremendous value to our city. They should be involved in every aspect of the planning and development of their community. And the key word is community. They should always feel that it's part of East Boston, and that East Boston folks should have the opportunity to help plan it and help participate in it and help prosper alongside of it. And unfortunately, that really didn't happen down the South Boston waterfront. It became more about who you knew and who you hired, and a lot of side deals, as evidenced with things that were reported in the newspaper. And as a result of which, it feels more like Manhattan than it does South Boston. And unfortunately, that's where we're at right now. So those are the lessons I think we can learn moving forward. But again, I want to emphasize, this was not on this administration's watch. This was the previous administration, and it was the previous administration's BRA that led those efforts and were part and parcel to what we have down there now. And as a result of which, our hope is that we've learned from that lesson, and that as we start to look at other neighborhoods and we start to continue to plan and as our city continues to grow, that we won't have a repeat performance of that, where it was, again, more about who you knew and who you hired, and the directly impacted community was basically at one point cut out of that process. And so in the mitigation and the community benefits and the linkage money that flowed with it also didn't necessarily go to the impacted community as well. So lessons to be learned. Hopefully the same doesn't happen on your community, Madam Chair, and in other communities, particularly I can see Councilor Bach, she got some significant development happening in her district as well. These are things that we all need to be very mindful of as we move forward as a city. So I appreciate the opportunity to be heard, and look forward to listening to other testimony, and appreciate obviously members from the BPDA and from D&D. I see Sonal and Tim on. They do great work. They've been very responsive, as well as Brian Glasscock. They've been very responsive to this body. And I think they share a lot of what they care about, and a lot about what we're saying today. So thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bach, then Councillor Sabi George, and Councillor Jania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say today I'm strongly in favor of us adding a fair housing zoning amendment to the Boston Zoning Code. I think that zoning was one of the chief tools used to segregate and exclude people in America, was and is. And it isn't going to become inclusive automatically or by accident. You have to make explicit efforts to make it so. And so I really think being proactive on that front is something we need to do on the city side. I have read the language and also the full fair housing report. And
thank you.
I think I think there are probably three sort of buckets of concerns I have just about how we draft.
Right.
One is, and I apologize if we, if times were different, I might have also had an annotated red line for everybody, but I don't. So this is just conceptual at the moment. But
we're making it work.
So the first thing is just that, this amendment currently operates at the large project or PDA level and tends to think a bit in terms of neighborhoods. And I think, I think that we need to bring an equity lens into our large project PDA level conversation. And that's where this is coming from. I think we need to really make sure, as we think about fair housing zoning amendments, that we're also explicitly sort of putting things in that are operating at a citywide level, because our city is so segregated. So, it means a lot to me and to many of my constituents to bring affordable housing into the neighborhoods that I represent. And many of the neighborhoods of District 8 have already been economically and racially segregated so much over the years that I wouldn't want us to memorialize fair housing language that implied that we were just going to make sure we reproduce things. Because although it's important in terms of blocking displacement for us to look at where people currently are, I think, righting the wrongs of segregation over time means aspiring to do better over time, especially in the places where people have been excluded. So I'm definitely anxious to make sure that we have mechanisms for sort of thinking at that citywide level and thinking about redress at that level. And I certainly was aware in the time that I worked at the city over at the Boston Housing Authority of sort of like reading back through history and seeing parcels that, are city owned that could have been parcels for gents housing, and then their zoning was changed to parkland because of like who lived around there and people not wanting it. And so I just think there really are cases where we need to be, if we're going to get serious about fair housing and zoning in this city, we need to get serious about creating some of those opportunities. And I want to make sure, I think, frankly, the Article 80 moment is too late for some of that. And so just trying to think a little bit about how we insert that broader goal in. The second concern of mine is just making sure that we're specific enough in our language that that we not inadvertently create a tool for blocking multifamily housing development. I say that as somebody who, I just supervised a thesis of somebody who was focusing on sort of the efforts in the suburbs to fight 40B developments. And the number of things that people will hang their hat on in an effort to block multifamily housing is really astonishing. And, you know, again, coming out of the world of trying to find places to put project-based vouchers, when we talk about, like Hajar was referencing, getting lower AMI income families into our neighborhoods, a lot of times for us to do that at scale, we actually need some like multifamily developments to put them in. Personally, I think we should be doing a lot more 100% affordable project-based voucher buildings around the city. And I think something like that is obviously in the interest of fair housing. But I also think that sometimes people think that keeping the people who live in a neighborhood, keeping them means keeping like the same shape housing stock that already exists. And I think there can be confusion there. And so I just think it's really important for us to make sure in drafting this that we're explicit about some of the, I think, like goals that are implicit in this. And one of the things that I most want us to bring out explicitly that I think has really motivated this, and Councillor Edwards' work for years now, is this issue of how do we explicitly say the city is trying to create housing for people, for families of diverse incomes across our city. Like, and that just we need to be super clear that that's part of what we mean when we say we want our zoning code to affirmatively further fair housing. So I think that's really important. I think, and then the third thing related to specifics is just that, unfortunately, there's not like a great world of jurisprudence on affirmatively furthering fair housing. And actually, you know, that was why so many of us were excited about the Obama administration's move to create the AFFH rule, because it kind of gave like administrative teeth and function to that objective, which is law and has been the law of the land for 50 years. But it's one thing to say something's the law of the land. It's another thing for it to have a kind of robust case law behind it. And unfortunately, our judicial support for the affirmatively part of furthering fair housing, which for people who may not know, the distinction there is there's kind of an initial standard of fair housing that tends to be what plays out in our fair housing case law, which is I can prove that you discriminated against me. Like I went to go try to buy or rent this house and you discriminated against me because I'm a part of a protected class, my race, my family composition, whatever, right? And so we have an apparatus for proving that. But affirmatively furthering fair housing, to what Councillor Edwards has said, is about seeing this whole historical institutional effort to exclude people from certain places and saying, what are we going to do to affirmatively unwind that clock? And unfortunately, what kind of a case you can bring on that basis and be successful is much more variable. And so because I say all of that to say that I think that we can't count on the legal system through, you know, subsequent impact litigation providing a set of like specific standards on this front. So I think it gets all the more important for us to be specific about what we're achieving, because basically we're trying in the city level to substitute for what HUD was doing at the national level. And there were a lot of people at HUD who were assigned to kind of think through whether cities' plans pass muster. And unfortunately, they've all been reassigned to other functions, very intentionally and malevolently, in my opinion. And so I just think for that reason, I'd suggest that we add a little bit more specificity about how we expect these standards, what we expect the standards to be, and how we expect them to play out for it to be successful. But so yeah, and I'll just say also that I don't think this substitutes. So I think we should be doing like SMART goals and standards, you know, and really thinking that through in the zoning code amendment. I'll also say I also like the idea that's actually in the city's draft report of putting something in the preamble of the zoning code. I don't think that's adequate. I don't think putting something in like a sort of commitment in the preamble is adequate, but I think that the idea, which is goal 7.1 for folks looking at the report, it's on page 10, I think, of the draft report. There's some proposed language around you know, amending the preamble of the Boston Zoning Code to include as one of its purposes to affirmatively further access to affordable housing by all inhabitants of the city, consistent with the requirements of federal, state, and local fair housing laws in any manner which ameliorates patterns of segregation and relatively high rates of poverty based on census tracts. I think just something, and whether it's exactly that language or not, I just think I think basically we should do something that is both affirming that overall goal and then also helping to lay out a pretty specific path forward in the legislation. So those are my comments. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And just to emphasize, or just to push, or not even push back, just to make sure I'm clear, you wanted specific language or definitions for the standards that we would be holding developers by. For example, the impediments, defining what those are, defining what are meaningful actions more succinctly, possibly, or what areas of definition?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So yeah, there's a couple things. So one is that I'd be interested in thinking about how we add an element of this. This was sort of my first point, that even goes above the Article 80 level and thinks more explicitly about how we're putting this in as a planning piece. And then yeah, at the Article 80 front, I think we really need to think through what do we think that kind of adequately addressing this bucket would look like? Because part of my concern, frankly, is there was a reference earlier to affirmative fair housing marketing plans. And fair housing marketing plans have become a thing that you file as part of the industry. But I don't think that they've really achieved any stretch goals around affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so I guess, and it's something that I want to have more conversation on, really thinking about what would move the needle. Because I guess for me, my point would be, Madam Chair, that somebody reassessing their unit mix and changing it in ways that allow us to house a more diverse set of Boston families is responsive in the way that we would want it to be. Somebody writing a plan for how they plan to do something or other, I just wouldn't want this to turn into kind of another set of shelf documents, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I just think it would be good to talk through. I always find it clarifying to talk through what is the behavior we're really trying to drive, and then to try to write as specifically for that as possible. Because I think in the current language, I think that the things we want are a possible outcome, but I also think a bunch of less compelling, robust things are also possible outcomes.
Thank you, Councillor Bott. I'll come back. I had some more questions, but I wanted to make sure everyone got a chance. Councillor Asabi George, Councillor Janie, then Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, and thank you everyone who is here today on this call and present. I unfortunately have to jump. I have an 11 o'clock commitment, but I will try to re-engage if this lasts longer. Thank you again to your leadership on this, and Kenzie, I appreciate your comments and questions right there, because I think that was, I've learned a lot from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Janie?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, so I guess first I would start by just applauding the makers. So Councillor Edwards, thank you for your leadership. Once again, another solid piece of legislation. I'm speaking from someone whose district is disproportionately impacted. I'm speaking as someone who has just picked up the book, The Color of Law, and the evidence is quite clear in terms of how we got here. And I'm a firm believer that it is not enough to stop doing a behavior that is hurting someone. And I'm not even clear that we have stopped that, so I want to be real clear. But it is not enough to stop that behavior. You must also repair the harm. And unless we repair the harm, we are never going to have true justice. And so I am in full support of this amendment to the zoning code. I'm in full support of doing our development and planning in this city with an eye toward equity. I'm in full support of doing it in such a way that ensures that all truly does mean all, and we are not leaving those who are most vulnerable behind. And so for me, it is really important that we make sure that we're doing all that we can to actively engage folks who have been left out and marginalized. As someone who was not just the president of the Boston City Council, but represents District 7, I see this all too well. 6 generations of my family in Roxbury, and have seen the changes of who is being displaced and pushed out of the community. And again, it's not enough to say, and I'm grateful for the changes that I've been able to make, along with all of the housing activists and my colleagues on the council that has moved the needle forward. I know, in my district, we got some good affirmative language in around anti-displacement and equity language around ownership in the Plan Dudley, but it is not enough. And the language isn't strong enough. We have to make sure that there's more teeth to all of this. So I'm in full support. And I guess, and I had a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask, but really what I'm interested in from the administration's side, from their point of view, what are, the stumbling blocks here? Because from my standpoint, this speaks to what we say we're about. And I think it's important that we can't just say it. We can't just hope that we have someone leading a department who gets it, and so therefore we're good. We have to make sure, and it's our job as the Boston City Council, as legislators, so I want to be real clear about what I've been sent to do. It's our job to make sure that we are enacting policies that benefit the people that we represent. And so I can't rely on the goodness of someone's heart when it comes to that. I can't rely on, oh, great, there's someone good leading that department or that organization or that institution. What I need, and I think what this body is asking for, is that we codify what we say we believe in. So if in fact we believe in equity, and if in fact we believe in planning where we are not displacing the residents of this city and pushing them out of the city, if we believe in racially diverse and economically diverse neighborhoods, then I'm not clear what the challenges are. I'm not saying, that this is perfect. And so if there are some challenges, I want to just make sure we're getting things on the table and addressing them, because in my mind, there is an urgency to moving forward. And again, I just like to understand from the administration's standpoint what they see are the challenges here, because in my mind, this is a good piece of legislation. I fully support it. And I just want to understand from the administration what the challenges are. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And before anyone from the administration responds, I just want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councilor Mejia. So I don't know if Sanal, Brian, or Tim want to respond to any stumbling blocks or.
Sure. So thank you. I was hoping to listen to all of the testimony before getting into some of the details, but I can talk about some of the work that we've done to date. And Councilor LeBach, thank you so much for some of the comments. Thank you, Justin, for being part of this panel as well. We've actually taken a long look at the paper that Justin was an author on that was released in 2020 about mapping gentrification as part of our work and research. We are very, very concerned about asking the right questions, being as specific as possible on asking the right questions when it comes to, and where in our documents and processes we are asking those questions. So, Councillor Bach, to your points about this being citywide, large project review and PDA review are definitely, very big parts of our city. But, what about smaller parts of our city where we wouldn't capture them necessarily through the Article 80 review process? And how does this work there? How do we make sure that we're leveraging city-owned resources to, accomplish some of these goals that we're talking about? Working with, we've been working and having good conversations with our colleagues in other city departments, the Office of Housing Stability, really getting into some of the things that have already come up, which is so great to hear about families with children. Are we looking at the right income levels? 70% AMI, is at the right income level? What about those folks who don't speak English? What about substandard housing? We're working really, we're hoping to get further along, but as you know, we've got a lot of our staff, including me, has been pushed and pulled in different directions due to the ongoing crisis. But this work is really important, and how do we work with our Fair Housing Office to identify key issues that they would like to see are discussed, and most importantly, what questions are we asking so that we are not inadvertently causing developers to come in after a lot of the work has been done or displacement has already been done. So we're asking the questions in the right way at the right time to have the most meaningful impact and the most meaningful results. The Fair Housing Marketing Plan came up as well. So, as part of these conversations.
Sonal, I actually do want you to do a summary after, if that's okay. Councillor Jania, if that's okay. I wanted to allow for the other colleagues to ask their questions. Some have to go. I have a lot of questions too. And then in one group, Sonal, you were doing a great job. You were talking citywide and answering per councillor, but if that's okay, I'm going to have, I got some text messages. People have to go. Okay. So thank you so much for your response. I will put a pause on that. Councillor Wu, Councillor Baker, then Councillor Arroyo, and again, Councillor Mejia after that. Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to be clear, I was not the one texting and trying to move along, but I will take it, and I'm glad to be able to ask the question. So thank you all for being here. I mostly wanted just to express my continued support for the lead sponsor and her push to make sure that we are doing everything we can to codify what has been stated over and over again as a shared value across the council, the administration, and certainly the community. I echo many of the points that were made by colleagues before. I appreciate Councillor Bach's focus on how are we not just thinking about what the laws will say and the actual text of the regulations that we're following, but how does that actually get implemented to the point where we are seeing more vibrant mixed income communities. So I will not miss the opportunity also just to emphasize that I do believe we need to continue to push for true planning, that abolishing the current structure of the BPDA, not all the functions within it, but that the organizational structure we are still using now, decades after urban renewal, is holding us back because we are not doing the citywide master planning that feeds into zoning on a regular basis, that keeps residents engaged on that very, very front end of visioning and taking action to define what their community should be. And therefore we end up at this sort of end point where the conversation is who should have the burden or responsibility of affirmatively requiring fair housing. And right now, the reality is that even though we say developers are doing most of the planning around specific parcels and this and that, at the end of the day, it is still advocates and community members who are then pushing the developers who then make concessions to get some of this through. So the burden should be on the city, on the public sector to take charge for planning and to have accountability and teeth in that. So I think this push is certainly in line with that larger vision of moving towards true citywide community-centered planning. So thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you. I have Councillor Baker, Councillor Arroyo, and Councillor Mejia.
Yeah, just a quick question on this passes the council, then does it go to the mayor and then over to zoning commission for approval? Can you walk me through a little bit of what the process here is?
Yes. So Councillor Baker, if this passes the council, we can go to the zoning commission, at which point you file the amendment. The BPDA can respond pro or against it, and they file a report and they do what they're going to do. Ideally, we pass this together and the BPDA and the council have agreed on language, so there is no back and forth or contention at the zoning commission, and we as a united front are going to the zoning commission. But if we are not and it passes the city council, then it's this amendment and the BPDA in opposition to it or with certain changes. The zoning commission will hear both arguments and could deny this amendment or could accept it.
Okay, and the other thing is you had talked about this being sort of playbook or I forget what word you used for maybe other cities to follow suit? What about towns like Newton and Brookline? So how do we get places like that into shape that don't even come close to their 40B and their advocates to us?
Well, you highlight one of the biggest problems that we have is that we are an island in trying to build, period, as you know, right? We're the only, us, Cambridge, and maybe Somerville, the only cities who are actually even trying to build, period, even if we may have divergent opinions on how well the building's going. We cannot, as a city council, necessarily enforce or tell them to do something in their zoning code. I don't know if you saw in Newton recently, they tried to approve a multifamily, a large building in Newton, and in response, they did a referendum and actually put it on the ballot as to whether they would allow for it to happen. So the city council and zoning approved it, and the citizens of Newton pushed for it to be voted against. Luckily, they lost, so they will be getting one of the largest multifamily unit building in Newton's history. So it will take organizing, and it'll probably take state laws. The governor is trying at the state level right now to amend zoning so that it doesn't require a 2/3 majority, but a simple majority, so that good projects will pass through the zoning boards in cities. So there is work being done to try and open up the other cities. I think 75% of cities around Boston zone for only single families. And that's, I'm not including Somerville and Cambridge. So, but that is a huge block to people even having choices whether they want to stay in Boston or not. So agree with you 100%. It is not just our burden to have, it's everyone's. But what we can do, advocate, push the governor's bill, push other bills that push for transit-oriented development, and loosen up those zoning laws.
Thank you.
Councillor Arroyo?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Edwards, for bringing this forward and really leading on this issue. I support this as it's written. I think a councillor before me spoke about the seaport. Well, two councillors before me spoke about the seaport. The seaport as a neighborhood didn't exist at my birth and was essentially created during my time in Boston. And it hasn't stopped being created. I think in the last 6 years, there's certainly been cranes in the sky, and there's still cranes there now. And a lot of the diversity and the things that we're seeking, they're not being implemented there. Those cranes aren't indicative of new diversity or different faces in those neighborhoods. And frankly, when we talk about the rest of the city, we've seen more displacement, we've seen more gentrification. And I think this is a situation where we can proactively, through a fair housing amendment, really get to reversing harm that we have created and that we have participated in as a municipality. And so I commend this. I do have to jump off on another call. I am essentially here to learn best practices and ways we can do this. But I do support this. I support the spirit behind it. I support the efforts behind it. And I think it's incredibly crucial in a city where, I think if you went and spoke to most of our constituencies, I can certainly speak for mine, where they don't feel that Hyde Park, Roslindale, or Mattapan, the new housing coming in is reflective of these kinds of values. And so this is somewhere where the city can really lead on this. I support this fully. I commend the maker for coming up with something very solid here to try and proactively work on this. And I'm happy to listen and continue to learn from my colleagues on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia, and then we'll start the second round. I do want to acknowledge that we've been also joined by Dwayne, let me make sure I get Dwayne Tyndall, and also Sophia Owens, two advocates who have been at our working sessions. At the beginning, Dwayne and Sophia, we had kind of folks in the advocates community express support or concerns or anything about the amendment. So before we go back into City Council, if you two wanted to make some quick remarks, or pass on, it's also fine as well. And then we'll finish I'm sorry, then I think Justin may have some questions or some suggestions. I see Jason Arroyo as well. I don't know if he also wanted to say anything, but I'm trying my best to make sure everyone can work in this working session. So that's why I'm calling on everybody and have an opinion and thoughts, okay? So now I have you on deck, but I just want to make sure everyone is able to give their opinion and thoughts. Councilor Mejia, I apologize. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair, Councilwoman Edwards. I appreciate you bringing us together. So just really quick, I'm super grateful for your hard work on this issue and pushing the work forward for fair housing in our city. Last night, our office held a community conversation with members of the LGBTQ+ community about their lived experiences during COVID-19. And one of the first things that we talked about was the need for fair housing. This is an intersectional issue that touches upon every community in the city of Boston. And what came out of our conversation, most of all, was the need for accountability. And this is why I'm so excited to see that this text amendment includes accountability to protect classes, accountability for the creation of new jobs, and accountability for English as a second language programming. This is a good piece of legislation, and I urge the administration to work with us as quickly as possible to make this happen, especially during this crisis, but long before it. Housing has been an obstacle to overcome for many communities in our city. I'm eager to continue the work, calling people in instead of calling people out, and moving the work forward to hold ourselves accountable. And one of the things that I will say is that in terms of when I was out knocking on doors, is I heard everywhere, no matter what part of the city that I was in, is that people felt excluded from the process. And I believe that we have an opportunity to right the wrong and change the way we do business, and making sure that we're looking at planning from a community-centered approach, and that those who are living the realities are informing our thinking, and that we are leading with equity. So I'm here to say that I'm in full support of this and looking for ways for the city to hold themselves accountable to those they serve. I too have to jump off in a little bit, but I just want you all to know that I'm in full support, and I'm here for the work. I'm including helping everyone think through how do we engage those who have never been engaged in the planning process in ways that really make sense. So here for all of it, and thank you, Councilor Edwards, for your continuously tenacity, I guess that's what it's called.
That's what it's called.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Councilor Mejia. We have been joined by also Will Onuha from the Fair Housing Office. He's also here for the administration. I apologize, Will, I didn't recognize your number at first, so if you're still on,
No worries,
I didn't know if you had anything to say. Will?
Yes, I'm here, Councilor. Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Did you have any comments, or can we just go on through the other folks? But I want to acknowledge that you were here.
No, sure. I'll certainly comment after everyone else, as I think Sanal has been doing a really good job. And any questions anyone has for me, I'm also here to answer or weigh in on as well, too.
Thank you, Will. Again, if someone else joined from the administration and I didn't recognize you or haven't been able to comment, or please, you probably have to text it to me or just interrupt at some point, but I'm not doing it on purpose. I can't necessarily see everyone or recognize their phone number. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Dwayne and Sophia and Jason, I didn't know if you had any questions, thoughts, support for the amendment before we go back. Again, I want to make sure the advocates who made the time on the task force doing the work can be working.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dwayne.
Yes, this is Dwayne, Alternatives for Community and Environment. And someone talked about the reality of Brookline and Newton. And I would tell people, you really don't want to be Brookline, because 40B is basically destroying neighborhoods as we speak in Brookline. The other thing that we could do, it's a Massachusetts analysis of impediments. Same way the city of Boston has series of analysis of impediments as a document, the state has one also. So the same way the real leadership I believe the city of Boston could really provide is following the analysis of impediments and the assessment for fair housing, and hold the state, the total state, accountable to their own analysis of impediment that they agreed to HUD to follow and have not been following. Very similar how historically the city of Boston have not followed. So the only thing I want to remind folks, this is the law of the land. Fair housing is not fair, it's the law, it's enforceable, and this is the best opportunity to do it on our own versus eventually having some level of enforcement coming down on the city. And the last thing I would say that the city and the state are both entitlement, meaning they receive HUD funding, right? And the key of receiving HUD funding is having an analysis of impediments or assessment of fair housing plan to direct us to a point where the city of Boston is a more integrated city, right? This is the plan. And we have a plan in place. And I think it is our benefit towards our benefits if we follow the plan that we have in place. So this is just a quick reminder. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Sophia?
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I'll be really brief. This is Sophia Owen, the staff attorney at Alternatives for Community and Environment. You know, as Hodger said, we do support the amendment. The thing that all of this is all of the comments today is making me think about is that the amendment is very important, but as has been said by Councilor Bach and Edwards, we do need a citywide plan, and the project that was spearheaded by the Professor Jennings and putting together the report on the assessment for fair housing is one tool that the city can use to do that. So I want to make sure that as we're moving forward with something that's going to correct the Article 80 issues with equity, that we are also keeping our eye on the big picture and how to integrate equity more broadly into the planning processes for the city overall. And also that I think the moment that we're in with COVID-19 has just highlighted the need for these policies to be implemented more broadly and the lack of equity in the city. And I want to make sure that even as we're responding to these public health and economic crises, that housing doesn't get put aside as a lower priority.
Thank you. I don't know if Jason wants to say anything. Did Lincoln? I didn't know if.
Hi, how you doing? How you doing, Councilor Edwards?
Before you start, Lincoln, I'm just checking in at Jason. Don't know if he's still.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to say anything before Lincoln?
Sure. So Jason DeRozier, Alston Brighton, CDC. I agree with everything that's been said, and Alston Brighton CDC fully supports this text amendment in the zoning code. We have approximately, last time I checked, about 4,000 units of development in the pipeline somewhere in the BPDA pipeline. A majority of that is large project review through Article 80. We have two projects as of right now calling themselves kind of the next Kendall Square in Alston. And once the Mass Pike project goes through, there's going to be 50 acres of developable land that Harvard owns that will be open for redevelopment. So I want to make sure that Alston Brighton can remain to be a safe, stable, healthy, equitable neighborhood of choice for any resident who wants to call Alston Brighton home. And this text amendment and ensuring that fair housing is in the Boston zoning code is kind of the first step in that. And so Alston Brighton CDC remains ready to help kind of move this as much or as little as you need us to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry to cut you off, Lincoln. If you would just say your name and organization and go from there.
Sure, thank you. Lincoln Lormond, Boston Tenant Coalition, also at the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Community Advisory Committee. And certainly the BTC supports the amendment. The Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Community Advisory Committee supports the amendment. We believe it's been a long time in coming, and there certainly is a huge need for fair housing to be part of the zoning. And I think, at the risk of repeating what everyone else has already said, we're at a pivotal point in time, and I think COVID-19 has just highlighted so much of the inequities and disparities that exist across the city of Boston. And there's so many different intersectionalities that really impact really responding to this in a comprehensive and a substantive way. So as we look at certainly supporting the amendment, we also want to look at addressing some of the core issues that we're seeing revealed every day. And there's been mention about the document that Professor Jennings was a part of, and certainly our committee was a part of at the city and the committee over the past couple of years. And we think that would be a good framework to really address some of these other equity issues that exist across the city of Boston. So just in closing, we certainly support the amendment.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we go back through on second round of questions, Justin, or anybody who has a specific text suggestion, I'd love for them to kind of put that out there. I don't know, Justin, if you had some specific areas of definition, or, yeah, there you are, Justin. I see you. And I just need to unmute. 1 second, I need to unmute.
Sorry, here I am.
There we go.
So a few concrete suggestions that came to my mind while we've been discussing this is potentially, and I defer to you, Councilor Edwards, and the other people who are more experts, but just some ideas that came to mind is potentially including some type of anti-displacement preference for some of the affordable units in the Project 80 developments, for instance, for applicants with a rental subsidy that is going to be expiring in the near future, or also potentially a preference for those Boston residents who are at imminent risk of displacement as documented by a no-fault notice to quit or notice of lease renewal, or potentially a non-payment where the rent is more than 50% of their income or something along those lines. And I think also in the spirit of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule, looking for the data that HUD was providing in that rule, which I think was very helpful about disparities on the basis of protected characteristics in housing needs, such as units with incomplete kitchen or plumbing facilities, severe housing cost burdens, housing overcrowding, and home ownership. So essentially requiring new developments to make sure that they're at least contributing to reducing these disparities on the basis of protected characteristics in housing needs, and certainly not exacerbating them. And then also some expectation about the mix of unit sizes and unit rents that will not have the effect of making units inaccessible to Boston residents in a way that has a disparate impact on the basis of protected characteristics. I think those three could be some concrete measures that could advance this. And I think we could also look to HUD's very extensive and thoughtful list of impediments and include that in the analysis of impediments. We're focusing on the ones that are relevant to project developers as opposed to cities as a whole, because not all of them would be relevant to developers. So those were some thoughts that I had briefly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going now into the city councilors to, or I'm going to do my quick questions, and Sanal, then if you could break down, or Tim and Brian also in support of Sanal, or if Will has any thoughts. It's 11:31, so we'll probably have you guys respond to everybody, and then we'll go back to very last minute comments, suggestions, and then we'll close out. I think we can do that. So just making sure that when you respond, Sanal, I want to be clear to folks. We are talking about a standard for the zoning code, and then also many folks are suggesting checklists for measuring that standard. And so in many cases, the checklist for that standard would include looking at displacement, would include looking at income, would include looking at racial disparities. But I want to be clear, that language and those things will not be part of the actual zoning amendment. The zoning amendment creates a standard for which you have to look at those things and ask those questions, okay? So a lot of folks are having wonderful suggestions and checklists. Why is that important? Because one of the back and forths we've had with the administration is, how do you measure and how do you look at affirmatively furthering fair housing? So this checklist and these thoughts add to that bucket. So this has been very fruitful. So now that we have some suggestions for that checklist and we have also the language, Councilor Jania asked, and I'm going to repeat in my ask, what are the stumbling blocks to the language so far in terms of concerns, issues, definitions that still need to be fleshed out? That is something that's very important to look for me, is to figure that out from the administration. Also, when we're looking at these suggestions, one of the other suggestions I received is having in the preamble, is the BPDA open to the language of the preamble that puts affirmatively furthering for action in the head of the zoning code, and also looking at administrative provision section 5 of the zoning code, having some language there. But I think what's important for us, or for me, is to figure out where are you in your analysis of this particular amendment, and what do you need from us to help with that analysis. And Director Golden mentioned there are certain resources, there are certain monies, there are certain things that will need to be increased. And it would be great if, not now, but one day the BPDA responded with what that increase looks like. So those are all of the kind of questions and thoughts now. And while I appreciate the analysis of all the things that the BPDA is doing, if I understand there's still no zoning amendment and no standard for which the BPDA is being measured by any of these things. So it's great, we've talked about, and the city has done a lot of different things, but there's no standard to measure it by and no language in the zoning code. So just to make that very clear to other people as well. So take it away, Sanal, or Tim, or Brian.
I can go first if you'd like. I want to say again that we're very happy to be here. We're very happy to hear a lot of the conversations that have been had today. Justin, I'm not sure if you were on the call earlier. I mentioned I talked about the report, the MIT report on gentrification. That was really interesting, that we looked at closely as well as part of our research. And we're very open to an amendment. We're here to listen. We really, is that a fire alarm? Is that mine?
No.
And we're here at the table to really, to hear what the concerns are. This has been amazing. I've been taking a ton of notes, and it's important that we are, to Councilor Bach's, points earlier. How do we look at the citywide? How are we making sure that our processes and procedures are inclusive, as inclusive as possible? And we are furthering, I want to use that word carefully because it has a lot of meanings. We're furthering our efforts in a meaningful and impactful way.
Thank you. So specifically in terms of the stumbling blocks on this particular, or analysis, when you approach this amendment, what are you looking for and what do you need from us? Are there definitions that are not clear? Are there standards that need to be defined? We're willing to put the work in, but we really do need some direction as to where you are finding some deltas.
I think what we would welcome is conversations like this to continue these thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, we're really taking advantage of some of this time, given the fact that we're all kind of pulled in different directions, but also when we have prioritizing this in our free time to make sure that we're looking at the existing processes, existing developments, what our goals are, making sure that we're not having unintended consequences as we're looking at this. Looking at other cities, this was touched upon a little bit during the conversation, but this is a difficult topic, and a lot of other cities are struggling with this as well. So we're looking at what Austin is doing, what Toronto, Seattle, New York City, Portland, Philadelphia, LA, Justin, in your report, as I mentioned. And then also, like I said earlier, making sure that we're asking the right questions. And so this discussion today is really helping us kind of hone in on making sure we're asking the right questions to get the right results.
Tim or Brian, is there anything in the language when you read it that is not clear that you think needs to be defined or needs more work? I'll say this. There's nothing about your suggestions or thoughts that is or intended to bind the administration in support of this amendment. But just as planners, just as thoughts of looking at this amendment, are there anything that could be improved or things that are unfamiliar? That would help us, honestly, at least allow us to do the work we want to get to a better place for you. But that's what we're looking for. I'm looking for a direct response to the amendment.
This is Tim Davis. I think one of the challenges is I think it does need more detail and more thought into how it would be implemented and what that would mean in an implementation process. So I think harkening back to some of what Councillor Bach said, I think it would be very useful there would be further discussion about what some of the definitions are, what do they mean. This is not something that many other cities have gone into this level of detail on, and so we're very interested in looking to see both how it can be implemented, but being in support of the goals behind this amendment. And I did want to kind of add, it's kind of come up kind of tangentially to this meeting. We are still proceeding with the process of completing the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing document. It has been slow given the COVID-19 emergency. And so I am grateful for the advocates and groups out there that have been interested in this, that are being patient with us at this time. We are proceeding, but it's not been on the timeline we had hoped for, given that myself and other staff are working diligently to make sure that the resources that we are able to provide for the COVID-19 response are available and getting out to the public.
Hi, this is Nadine. I just wanted to follow up and ask Tim, is there a time frame for the response to the assessment of fair housing? As people know, we've spent about 3 years going back and forth with the city, and this was a requirement of HUD under the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule. And even though HUD suspended the rule under the Trump administration and then issued a new rule, the city really said that they would follow the original rule and finalize an assessment of fair housing. So we understand the crisis, but it would be great to have some time frame.
I am not able to give a very specific time frame, but I can say that there is progress being made. And I think that I don't want to pin myself down here. I am beginning to see some light in my schedule to work on some of it, and I've had a staff person working on it already. So there is actually work going on. But I do think that the next step will be probably getting together with the advisory committee again to continue our work on the objectives and goals that we had been going on in the fall, because there were some loose ends there, and I think that that will be the next step with the organization, some of whom are on this call today.
Thank you. Just to also let folks, oh, I'm sorry, Christy Doyle is from the BHA. I don't know if Christy's still on the phone.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Christy. And so I understand BHA has committed and is implementing Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing at that agency. And I'm curious, is there a checklist? Is there a definition of removing impediments? Are there ways in which the BHA is analyzing and implementing AFFH standards that we could use or borrow for the BPDA?
I'll answer twofold. Sorry, there is a checklist. We have been implementing. I'll also add that my colleague Robert Terrell, who is a member of the advisory committee, and also works doing fair housing for the BHA, is on the call as well, and you can tap him. But both of us, in conjunction with a working group, have have a list of impediments. We are already working on the goals that are enumerated in the report. I unfortunately don't have the report right in front of me, and so I couldn't give you a detailed report back on our progress, but I'd be happy to follow up on that in writing. Either Robert or I would be happy to do that. And whether or not the BHA's list or progress would be informative for the work of the BPDA, I can't really say. I think that the working group has, for the analysis for the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing report, has been really diligent in working with the city on crafting, their own list of the impediments and the analysis and what they'd like to see moving forward. And so I would just defer to that as kind of the word on that subject.
Could you send, thank you. I appreciate that. And I will certainly go to you and Mr. Terrell for any other standards or how you're implementing AFFH with BHA. I would love if we can get anything that you have in terms of how you measure, how you analyze your checklist for impediments. I think that would be a great tool. You are correct. Not all tools will be used the same way. There's planning, and there's direct housing of individuals in already built or to be built buildings. But I think at this point, I think something is better than nothing at this point. And I would love to see how the city in one arm is actually using a checklist for Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. Councilor Baker had a question.
We're happy.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're happy to provide.
Thank you so much. Councilor Baker had a question for Dwayne, specifically around the comment around how 40B is destroying or hurting communities. If you could give us a little context of what that means or what you were saying.
Yeah, so developers are basically going beyond zoning code, and when they can't meet zoning code requirements, they go to 40B and put in affordable housing and then build structure that is really not consistent with the neighborhood. They are destroying the character of neighborhoods very fast in Brookline. That's one of the greatest issues that we are facing here in Brookline. I'm a town meeting member for the past 8 years in the town of Brookline. I work around housing. I worked around fair housing with the Civil Rights Commission in the town of Brookline. It's a major issue how developers are using the lack of 10% of affordable housing and to circumvent zoning in the town of Brookline. It's happened in Newton. That being said, Brookline needs to figure out how to get to the 10%. And that being said, that they have it. Brookline also has an analysis of impediments. The state of Massachusetts have analysis of impediments. And if the town of Brookline would have done what they needed to do over the generation and not stock all the affordable housing in North Brookline and leave South Brookline as pristine suburb of wealthy folks, then they wouldn't be in this situation that we are in now. The other thing is, even when developers do the affordable housing, they still doing it on the high end of the area medium income at 60, 70, 80%. So it's not affordable. I go down my block and I'm seeing buildings that is eyesores for the neighborhood. So that's what I'm meaning, that, you know, Brookline, Newton, and many other entitlement towns and cities are struggling with 40B. And when I was working with the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston, and I went to and we did Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing seminars on the eastern side of the state. This is a chronic problem with many town municipalities all across East Massachusetts. And Mr. Terrell, which was basically, you know, my mentor, teacher, and the director of the Fair Housing Center, could tell you in much more detail that it's no way getting out of it. That's why I told the towns, and I would tell folks now, do it on your own volition. Don't wait until reality comes where possible enforcement and other things that could impact the city and impact our people. So that's what I meant.
Thank you. Councilor Baker, was that okay, or did you have a follow-up?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So it's about 10 to 12, and I wanted to go ahead and check in with the colleagues if they had any final questions or thoughts or comments, and then I will conclude with next steps and suggestions, and then we'll close out. So just again, going in, let me get my order of arrival, 1 second. Councilor Breadon, if she's still available.
I've no other questions at this time or comments. Just really, this is really essential work that we're doing, and I hope that we can make progress and get this done in short order in the very near future. Thank you.
Someone's cell phones? Okay. Councilor Flynn? Okay, he may have gone. Councilor Flaherty? He may have gone. Councilor Bach? Oh, Councilor Flaherty, or no, that's Mejia raising her hand. I'll get to you, Julia, I'll get to you. See you raising your hand. Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No further questions. Just want to say that my office definitely looking forward to being actively involved in drafting. I think thinking about how we add a citywide and sort of more a little up the food chain planning element into this is going to be important and appreciated. I just want to personally thank Professor Steele for coming today. I've definitely learned a lot from his work on fair housing. Also, looking forward to, I think, some of those suggestions about things that we could put in as potential criteria for what it means for development to affirmatively further fair housing could be really fruitful and helpful. So I'll certainly follow up with him on that front. I just want to thank the chair again for convening this and everybody for coming and weighing in, and say that I look forward to us figuring out a fair housing zoning amendment that hopefully the whole city can support and that we can use to really make change on this front. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Sabi George. She did jump off, I think. Councilor Jania.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say again that I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss this. I think it's a really important piece of legislation, this text amendment to the zoning code. We certainly need to do more to make sure that the residents of Boston can stay in Boston, to ensure that we're not discriminating and that we are actively seeking solutions that would ensure that this city truly is for everyone. So I appreciate your leadership. I also want to thank Tim Davis. I think that was the first piece of something real in terms of understanding what some of the barriers are. And it was around implementation. And certainly, I know that is something that, all city departments, whenever we move as a body, will have to think about implementation. And I'm certainly happy to think about implementation and next steps moving forward. But I think just to move this conversation forward, I would certainly appreciate getting a little clearer from the administration around any barriers that may put themselves beyond implementation. And so, again, I just want to be on the record with my full support. I think this is the right thing to do if we truly care about justice, if we truly care about housing and planning in our city that is fair, that is just, that is equitable. So happy to support and happy to continue the conversation, understanding what some of the barriers are so that we can address them. That's why I'm asking, so that we can address them and move forward. So again, thank you for your leadership. I look forward to continuing the conversation so that we can actually move this forward for a vote and get it done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wu, any final statements or thoughts? If you may have had to hop off. Councillor Baker, any final statements or thoughts?
No, thank you.
Councillor Arroyo may have gone. I think he's gone. Councillor Mejia.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to thank everyone who participated. I am really looking forward to moving beyond the dialogue and really figuring out, as President Council Kim Jania mentioned, what are those roadblocks? Because I believe that anything and everything is possible when we have the political will to do so. And so really looking forward to your partnership in that conversation. And again, I want to reemphasize my support for this amendment, as well as making sure that as part of the process, we're really thinking and being really intentional about a community-centered approach to planning, figuring out how we include those who are going to be deeply impacted by anything that's coming down the pipeline. It's more than just knocking on doors for our butters. I'd like to be a little bit more creative and challenging us to really think about what all means all, because as I've always said, that nothing about us without us is for us. And if we're not at the table, we're always on the menu. And I feel when it comes to issues of housing, we're always eaten up alive out here. And so looking forward to the accountability piece and figuring out how I can be a thought partner in that process. Thank you all for participating in this important dialogue, and Councillor Edwards for your continued leadership.
Thank you so much, Councillor Mejia. Are there any other councillors? If not, I'm going to go ahead and do some I'll conclude the hearing with some remarks. Okay. So I want to thank, first of all, the administration for coming. I do know that it's not an easy thing to do, and I do know that you are wearing more than one hat at this point, and a lot of your jobs, all of our jobs are going to depend on a lot of factors. We have no idea what's coming down the pipe in terms of what city we're going to inherit, what deltas we're going to have to deal with in any of our jobs. City councilors, you as planners, people in housing, our advocates. I mean, there is a moment of uncertainty at a level that it changes literally every day. So I wanted to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge the folks who are on the ground every day, the advocates who came today as well. They're usually the first call. They're the community's 911, and they're who people come to when they have nothing. And so I want to thank you for your partnership, your thoughts, and your time, your mentorship in between this on other phone calls, and really pushing this and demonstrating your belief that we can rise to the occasion as a city. So I want to say thank you. And in terms of next steps, in terms of what I will continue to do and work on is looking at the preamble, suggested language, looking at a citywide approach in terms of zoning for Councilor Bach's suggestion beyond Article 80. How does this become part of the BPDA's actual culture through zoning? And then I wanted to make sure that people understood all their great suggestions for what we need to be considering are part of, I think, a growing checklist. We look forward to getting the documents from BHA for their list. As Dwayne mentioned, the state already has a list of impediments that we will also look and want to remind people that these are wonderful things that will be looked at and questioned. However, I'm not putting the checklist and having a perfect list to analyze ahead of the zoning amendment. I believe we can go forward with a zoning amendment that directs the BPDA and developers to look at these checklists. And in prior iterations and conversations, I had offered that time to allow for us to pass the amendment and at one point offered a full year to actually come up with an implementation plan and actual checklists to make sure that when it became effective, as in enforceable, the city was ready to go. So I'm still of the mindset that we can pass good language that is clear, that is more defined, and then the standards or at least the checklists that hold people accountable can be developed within a certain time frame. Why do I believe that? Because that's what we do every day and every year with all of the other standards that we hold developers to. Think about environmental standards. They change every single year because our science changed every single year, and our understanding of what's going to protect us now is different than what it was 10 years ago. And what do we require the BPDA and developers? To adjust. So again, we will never have a perfect checklist because oppression, racism, homophobia is not perfectly checked, right? It's going to also change, and how it manifests and how it hurts people, how ableism hurts people will also change. So I want to be clear, there's a checklist conversation, and then there's the actual zoning amendment conversation. And I intend fully to bring this to a vote to push this through. I really do hope we have the BPDA's support and the language for it, but if we do not, I intend to push this through for my colleagues to at least for the city council to say that they support this amendment and we support a certain standard being implemented. I look forward to the continued conversation. I will not be pushing for a vote next week, just to be clear. I will actually go back and all of the suggestions that we got, I will take those questions, those thoughts, and implement and come up with another version of the amendment. And I hope that in that time, the BPDA has some suggestions, or again, I thank you again, Tim, for the implementation being a big concern, and would love to be able to pass something and then still work on perfecting that implementation. So without any additional comments or concerns, I want to thank all for coming today, and I'm officially closing out the hearing, or the working session on the on docket number 0232, zoning amendment, amending the Boston zoning code for affirmatively furthering fair housing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Economic impacts of COVID then feed into the capital budget planning. I don't want to give up our climate sort of intersection with how we're thinking about new buildings, how energy efficient they may be, the city's push to
maybe she went off mute.
move towards.
I think that's